My, on a Monday. Coming up, we take a look at the offseason for the Brooklyn Nets. Now knowing there will be no draft picks, how can Sean Marks and this organization go about improving the roster? Is this a stand pat scenario or potentially an opportunity for more veteran talent to be brought in at the cost of youth? We break down all of those different options right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. That's right. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. You know me. I am Adam Armbrecht, not only covering the Brooklyn Nets, but also the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack all off season long. We, of course, thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. We'll let you know. Today's episode is going to be brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online remains the number one spot this season where they've got you covered with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, it's where the game starts. And where we start, my friends, on a Monday, as we say, is looking now a little bit deeper into what this offseason looks like, now knowing, as Doug Norrie, not available today, told you on Friday, there will be no draft selection for the Brooklyn Nets. Doug outlined it. Go check out that episode on YouTube. Go get it on the podcast feed. Did a great job, really, at the expense of me. A little bit, let's be clear, because I was hoping, yes, that the Nets were going to hold on to that draft pick, not just from a content standpoint. It obviously is exciting, and we're going to get into what it means now not having it and how the Nets can try to improve. And if this is indicative of a more or less evolving offseason for the Brooklyn Nets here in a minute. But as Doug said on Friday, it's not just the content piece. It's also that it keeps more options open for a longer amount of time for Brooklyn if they had held on to that 23rd overall selection. I was a little bit surprised, not surprised, but Doug mentioned how you don't know what's going to happen with the 76ers. So that can play a factor in what happens going forward. We know fourth seed, certainly. Now, when they go out of the playoffs, that's going to impact where the strength of that draft pick ends up landing. But one thing to even add into the benefit of deferring that selection is just you may have more assets at your disposal next year, depending on how things unfold over the course of this season. There was one element of it that I did reflect back on a little bit. The Nets didn't have a lot of assets this past season, obviously. And when you're working down the stretch there, really, I think it would have been fascinating to know if the Brooklyn Nets had had their own draft picks, as opposed to the ones they gave up to Houston in order to acquire James Harden initially. What would the end of the season have looked like for them? Because they battled and fought to make sure that they got into the playing tournament and then ultimately secured that 7th seed and ultimately got swept at the hands of the Boston Celtics. But they really made a push for that, right? And we've kind of talked about all the different ways in which they went about it, the James Johnson minutes and then cutting him and elevating Kessler Edwards, but then not really using him, and all the DNPs and quite frankly, inconsistent and lackluster performances, even from the superstars over the course of that 4-game series against the Boston Celtics. But had they held their own draft pick, had they controlled their own destiny there as far as where they could have landed, it's funny. We'll get into this a little bit more later in the week. Doug and I are going to have a conversation around what it looks like in this version of the NBA. Is that model of, superstar, big three talent, just putting the big max contract guys at the top and filling in the pieces around it. Has that changed? How much has it changed? And is there a new dynamic, or is it just that there are more than one or two or three or four ways to create potentially a contending team? We're going to take a look at that. But obviously, I'm recording this before tip off of game number 2 in the finals, where you kind of have these contrasting ideologies to some extent. If the Nets could have had a little bit of Golden State Warrior kind of luck, where because of injuries, they ended up there in the lottery, and that's how they're able to kind of reboot themselves with some young talent. Maybe the Nets would have kind of pulled the plug on themselves, to the detriment, I think, of the relationship with the fan base, because as we know, we hear in the comments on YouTube, especially, it has been a rough handful of years since bringing in this elite level talent. So, would they have been able to survive in the wake of everything that's happened leading up to this point of saying, you know what, we're going to take it easy? Maybe we're not going to push our stars. Maybe a fluky quote unquote injury comes up that keeps Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving out of there, even if there had been some curiosity around Ben Simmons. Zero chance that's going to happen. And in some regards, maybe we would have seen even more of Day'Ron Sharpe, of Kessler Edwards, of Cam Thomas down the stretch and just said, you know what? And maybe even David Duke Jr. towards the end of the season, at least, in saying, hey, this is time for the rookies to play, enjoy themselves, get them experience, get them some reps, and results be damned. We want to put ourselves in a position to understand what is the long term goal. It's winning a championship. Do we, and I said this going back a couple of weeks ago, in their heart of hearts, if they didn't think they were capable of winning a championship, how do you set yourself up best to possibly win one the next year and in years to come? That option's not on the table because you make the decision you do around trading for James Harden, one that Doug and I have talked about a lot, one that I think the fan base wants to relitigate, and maybe understandably so when you see the evolution of the players that departed in that process. But that being the case, you did defer the pick. So now the question becomes, is it more or less likely that the Nets organization is going to make adjustments to this roster, or is it more likely that they're going to stand pat, that they're going to bring back some similar iteration of the roster that we saw at the back end of the season and basically say, this is the process we're in, and we're going to see how that evolves, at least at the start of the season. Doug also alluded to what could happen potentially as you get towards the trade deadline, now having that deferred pick in next year's draft. So you can certainly utilize that. Going to go into a little more detail on the trade exemptions. There is one difference when it comes to Spencer Dinwiddie one. Doug had all the numbers right, just a clarification around that, and then potentially what they could do. There is obviously the veteran side of it, and then there is the youth and rookie side of things, or what will be a handful of second year players, and whether or not the Brooklyn Nets feel like Cam Thomas, obviously Kessler Edwards feels like he's at the forefront, at least from a sample size and a productivity standpoint. And then Day'Ron Sharpe, right? So you have these three players. We know the Nicholas Claxton decision will be looming. The unrestricted free agency of Bruce Brown will be looming. And then there's even been a lot of fans that I think are calling for David Duke Jr. to get a more extended run and maybe be a part of that process going forward. So you have all those young players. And then, as we've highlighted before, you have this laundry list of veterans who either, I don't know, could be retiring, could some player options like Patty Mills, and then some other names. So I like Andre Drummond, obviously Blake Griffin, LaMarcus Aldridge. You know, the list is there for us. Goran Dragic as well. But there's some interesting, I think, decisions to make here around where are you going to fill in the gaps? Because 2 years ago, filling in the gaps made a lot of sense at the buyout market, at the trade deadline, making a lot of really smart moves, getting Blake Griffin, getting LaMarcus Aldridge, right? Those things were heralded as being enormously successful moves from Sean Marks. Fast forward a year later, the Javon Carters of the world, Bembry doesn't make it through the entire season. James Johnson gets cut down the stretch. No LaMarcus Aldridge essentially DNPing himself at the back end, along with Blake Griffin as well. You have the success of Goran Dragic, obviously, but not as successful of a in-season management of the roster as maybe a lot of fans would like. So we'll walk through some of that. We'll talk about the rookies and maybe display what could be a possible opportunity for the Brooklyn Nets to alter this roster in a significant way that I think could, on the one hand, excite the fan base, and on the other one, absolutely turn them irate. We'll break that down for you. All coming up here in a second. Right after, though, of course, we tell you about our friends over at Bet Online. That's because, as I told you at the top there, Bet Online is your number one source for all the betting, stats, sports info. How about this one? We're not going to get into it here. Maybe I'll bring it up. We want to do some network crossover stuff along the way. But Kyrie Irving's next team, if not the Brooklyn Nets, over on Bet Online, you got the Clippers at plus 200, the Mavericks at plus 250, the Rockets. Would they send him off to James Harden Island once upon a time at plus 300, and then the Bulls at plus 400, an Eastern Conference team vying for playoffs, vying for a deep playoff run potentially, maybe preparing to lose one of their superstar talents in Zach LaVine. you can get in on that action there if you're someone who's a bit of a pessimist, I would say, or an optimist, depending on how you feel about Kyrie Irving and how you feel about the Brooklyn Nets right now. You get over there on Bet Online, as we say. They're going to have you covered all throughout the NBA championship here in the finals. Game two, just about to get underway. Those have certainly flipped the odds coming in versus where they stand right now. NHL has their conference finals wrapping up, looking towards the finals here in another week or week and a half or so. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. You head over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. So, where then there's a couple of things here, housekeeping things, and then getting into this discussion. I think first and foremost around the youth, and it ties into the way Doug had laid this out. So the one note was just that at the time of the trade, Spencer Dinwiddie's trade exemption money that came in off of that, the one thing that they had going for them there is it ends up being 3.2 million. Now it had been larger, but 8.4 of that, it was a little north of 11, but 8.2, excuse me, million of that was applied towards Seth Curry's incoming contract. So now they still have the remainder. The TPE, you can use it in different portions and apply it on different trades or different scenarios and combine it in a few different ways. Unlike the James Harden, which was mentioned by Doug, that one doesn't expire until next off season, so you can hold on to it or maybe use it at the trade deadline. And then, of course, you're going to have that 6.2 million from DeAndre Jordan. Little bit of money splashing around there in the Dumboya trade to Houston. The mechanics there got you 1.2 and 1.6 for Millsap as well that they can hold until February of 2023. So there's some low level stuff there that they can use, but that's why, as someone had asked me over on Twitter, the 3.2, where that number, where that number gets so low from the Spencer Dinwiddie trade, they've already applied some of that. So with that being the case, the one thing that I think is also a wrinkle here for the Brooklyn Nets is depending on how you feel about Kessler Edwards, Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe. From the one side of it, and I talked to a few different hosts on the network. If you follow the network, we know we do the mock drafts. That's going to be getting underway coming up on the 16th. They'll start to have episodes coming out around that, and you can track some of the action and see where some of the names coming out of college are going to be heading in the pros. But I talked with a handful of teams around the league and asked the question, hey, just out of curiosity, what would it look like if you wanted to acquire Cam Thomas? What would you be willing to give up for him from a draft capital standpoint, from a player standpoint? And there's a couple of scenarios. I'm hoping to get some crossover episodes going where we kind of just break down what that would look like. So there's already, and just to gild the lily a little bit here, there's already some traction around what he is and what he can be. Going back to a week ago, 2 weeks ago, maybe at this point, Doug and I were talking about what can Cam Thomas be going into the next year for the Brooklyn Nets. We think instant number one, first guy off the bench, right? He's a spark plug, microwave scorer. He has to get better from the outside, more consistent. Those numbers seem to be going in the right direction before his minutes got drastically reduced down the back end of last season. The question becomes inside of the Brooklyn Nets system, if he's a off-ball two guard, does he have the highest level of functionality for what the Brooklyn Nets want and what they need to do? So if we look at it as Kyrie Irving's coming back and Ben Simmons is going to be healthy and Kevin Durant's going to be ready to go, let's just that's operate on that assumption first and foremost. Now, the nice piece of that is that you get Ben Simmons in a point forward role and he can be orchestrating the offense, whether it's Kyrie on the court with him or some crossover into the bench with Cam Thomas. So there's a lot of mechanics to think about how that can work itself out. But there already is an interest or a buzz around what Cam Thomas can be. And what's interesting to me is the Brooklyn Nets defer this pick. And for all the reasons that Doug had highlighted, you'll have more clarity next offseason. You'll have more clarity at the trade deadline, even. You'll understand maybe where your biggest need lies after you've seen Simmons and Irving and Durant play together. The other piece, though, is if you're looking at this as a pause button, what are the expectations for next year? Are the expectations that you'll come into the season and see how it plays itself out, and then if you can make tweaks, you'll make them along the way? Or is it we want to develop continuity over the season and then the next one? That's the big push, right? We want to have a deep playoff run this upcoming year, try to make the conference finals. That's going to be the goal. Anything beyond that is gravy. We love it. We get to the finals, win or lose, we're ecstatic. Depending on where the organization is setting the bar, then maybe striking when the iron could be hottest on one of your young players and getting value back, there's some potential there. I don't know. I think for any of these players, and we're using Cam as the example, I think the best version, no matter what you want to do with him, is get into the season. Let the season get started. Let him get out there on the court. Let him start to have a consistent and defined role, which is something, if he doesn't have that coming into this in year number two, then I think there's a real failing going on behind the scenes for the Brooklyn Nets, right? Assuming that he has that consistent role and he's getting night in, night out minutes, and he's performing consistently in that role, then all you're doing between the start of the season and the trade deadline is building up his value, building it and building it. Now, on the one hand, if it looks like the team is building chemistry and he's a key component of what they're going to be doing, you're locked and loaded. You feel great short, long term beyond Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, right? You're still going to have this player that can do a lot of good things for you on the offensive end. How is he developing defensively? How is he developing as a point guard as well? Because we saw a little bit of that, a little more facilitation towards the back end of last. So he can develop that area of game. Or do you think that, yeah, he sure can score, but we still need the defensive 3-and-D wing. We still need another one to go along with Kessler Edwards. We still need to figure out how are we going to match up against some of the bigger teams in the Eastern Conference or whoever may come out of the West. If that's the case, the maximized value could be found closer to the trade deadline where you could turn around and say, I want veteran X and I also want draft capital. And that's where I think it's interesting because we already said with where Cam Thomas was drafted, what in summer league when he's dropping buzzer beater winners, right? We said that's it. If you went back and redrafted right now, there's probably 5 teams of the Brooklyn Nets that would have took the chance to taking Cam Thomas. Now seeing even the small sample size of him. So now having deferred the 23rd overall pick to next year and wherever that ends up, could you end up with 2 first-round picks that you could combine to get up to target a specific player? Could you package together with the $11 million a trade exemption that's still going to hold over from James Harden potentially and say, we can go get player X from another team? That's what becomes fascinating about letting these young players get out there. And that includes Kessler Edwards. It includes Day'Ron Sharpe. I think, Day'Ron Sharpe is a far more interesting one. I want to get to him in a second here as well. And then Kessler Edwards, the funny thing about at least Cam and Kessler, we talked about this during the year where, and Doug and I will probably flesh this out a little bit more in that broader conversation. What does it look like in today's NBA and the model of player that you need? Is Kessler Edwards athletic enough? Is he quick enough, right? He does everything well that you want him to do, 3-and-D, but can he do it to the level that some of the other higher draft picks, high first round draft picks, showcase the ability to do? That's the question. Same thing with Cam Thomas, right? Is he big enough? Not big enough by NBA standards. Is he big enough for the Brooklyn Nets and the deficiencies that they have from a size standpoint? Or is he going to get swallowed up in some regards? And because you're not a bigger team, does that mitigate his value to you as opposed to another team? That becomes the fascinating part of it. And then, I mean, Day'Ron Sharpe just has a lot of questions around his game that I think he can develop in. And if he does, it answers another interesting question that we'll get to here in a second, which on top of which is also going to address the idea of if the rookies are developing for the future. Let's put it that way, because that's what I would prefer. I want Kessler Edwards. I want Cam Thomas. I want Day'Ron Sharpe to be a part of this team going forward. If they are developing and looking like they're taking that next step in year number 2, then we turn our attention to a couple of key veterans and ask questions of them and their value to this roster versus another team and what they could potentially get back in return. We'll tap into that right after we tell you that, of course, you've made the Locked On Nets podcast your first listen of the day. Why don't you make your second listen of the day the Locked On NBA Big Board? It's host Rafael Barlow, who you may be hearing the voice of right here on our podcast, breaking down some other non-draft prospects for the Brooklyn Nets to keep their eyes on this offseason. But he's over there with the NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter. He's joined by Richard Stamen, Sam Ferris, and Leah Thulin, giving fans an in-depth look at the NBA draft, the mock draft, the player rankings, and of course, the big board. So while the Nets may not have a pick in this upcoming draft, it doesn't mean that there won't be prospects at the back end of this draft They could be undrafted. They could get invitations to training camp. They could come up in G League and certainly give the Nets some options there. It's free on all those great platforms, just like our show is. Go check it out. You're not going to want to miss it. The other piece, then, after the youth part of it, I think, is just looking at the offseason assets as a whole. So we mentioned the exemptions have the hard part without having the draft pick means what are you pairing it with? You have to be thinking about pairing it with a player potentially in order to make things happen. Now, there's a couple of things here. One, the player option for Patty Mills. Listen, in my heart of hearts, if I thought that the Nets had viable veteran minimum, other options on the table potentially, I think in the grand scheme of things, you'd be better off probably getting Patty Mills to opt in on the player option and then also be able to trade him because we just highlighted what Cam Thomas is and what we think he can be. There's going to be redundancies here, right? And you acquired Seth Curry in the trade this past season for James Harden. So you already have another guy that can shoot from the perimeter. Now, there's a couple of wrinkles inside of this offseason that I think could be fascinating to keep an eye on. With those trade exemptions and trying to find partners, there's two ways that you can look at this. You can look at one of the young guys like a Cam Thomas and say, hey, who wants him? Get back assets, get back draft capital, and get back players, probably veterans. Again, I won't gild the lily on a couple of the names that are out there and some potential mechanics. The other one is a bigger name on this roster, and that would be someone like Joe Harris. Now, on its surface, if you think about this team being constructed and saying you have Ben Simmons running the point forward role, Kyrie Irving is there with him, you have Kevin Durant, you have Seth Curry, you have Joe Harris, right? Or you have Nicholas Claxton in the mix there. You're going to have obviously Cam Thomas coming off the bench. You're going to have Kessler Edwards in the mix there as well. But if you think about the idea of, would you like to have Ben Simmons out there with 4 shooters, 3 of which can do on-ball work, and then 1 in Joe Harris, who is an absolute fanatic when it comes to running the defense ragged and finding his spots? Yeah. And by the way, Joe Harris represents a little bit of size, at least relative to other players on this roster. Now, if you tell me that Patty Mills is gone, that makes it even more important, I think, to keep Joe Harris around. If, though, potentially, you told me there were teams out there that had a 3-and-D wing type of player, right? A veteran player that maybe fits that mold. If you could go player for player and take out Joe Harris, sharpshooting extraordinaire, and insert someone, a veteran, and this is not the player that I'm speaking to, but a guy like Crowder for the Phoenix Suns, right? Someone who's bounced around the league, but he shoots it at a good clip from the perimeter, and he can defend multiple positions, right? Now he's 31, I think going to be 32. So maybe, you're starting to trend in the direction of more veterans that could, have injuries or could find themselves. But Crowder has been an incredibly important player on almost every single team that he's been a part of. It's almost shocking that he keeps ending up on other rosters. But something like that, though, if you had enough confidence in bringing back Patty Mills in probably a greatly reduced role relative to what he was asked to do this past season because of injuries, etc., you have Seth Curry on a healthy ankle, we hope. You have Cam Thomas taking the next step forward. Would you sacrifice some of the perimeter shooting for a little bit more balance, a little bit more consistency on both ends of the floor? That's interesting. There's only a couple of guys on the roster that you can really consider the idea of doing that with. And I don't know. Everything about deferring the pick suggests to me that the Nets are going to stand pat and they're going to see how it plays out. And they're going to say, hey, if we can be healthy this year, then you're going to see a lot of shooting around a lot of talented players, and you're going to see winning. You're going to see playoffs. You're going to see deep playoffs. And if not, we'll deal with it next off season, or we'll deal with it at some point during the year, right? We can deal with it ahead of the trade deadline if it doesn't look like it's going well. I don't know how high Joe Harris's value is right now, given the fact that he's coming off of the ankle injury. But depending on how the first half of the season goes, as you get to the deadline, maybe the surplus just works itself out there. And then the more interesting thing might even be, where is Seth Curry in that mix because of how favorable his contract is at just $8.4 million and on the last year of his deal. You get 1 more year of Joe Harris, even though at a significantly larger cap hit. The other thing that I'll leave you with here when it comes to this offseason and how the Nets can reshape this roster, I think no matter what, bringing back Goran Dragic should be a priority for this team, because even if you got point forward in Ben Simmons, I think you want to have another veteran, traditional point guard on this roster. You saw it. You saw how it looked down the back half of the season. You saw the way it looked in the playoff games. He still has it. He can still get it done for you. And he can still be a positive influence on a guy like Cam Thomas. Someone who, by the way, and this isn't even, I'm not remotely knocking Kyrie Irving, but that's not Kyrie Irving's game first and foremost. Goran Dragic, that's what he's about. So maybe he can help bring him along. That's not Patty Mills' game, but maybe he can help bring him along. So returning him is absolutely critical. The other thing then to me, though, is Andre Drummond. And Doug and I will talk about this as the week goes along here. I don't want him back on this roster for the simple fact I understand what his value is and what he can do. And I also understand what the Nets don't have and where the deficiencies could be. So Nicholas Claxton, obviously, Doug and I said you should be bringing him back. Doesn't mean that he's going to be a guy that can bang against all the bigs, can get you rebounds, etc. But I want to see Day'Ron Sharpe. Whatever Andre Drummond gives you and whatever his deficiencies are, Day'Ron Sharpe can do something similar to what Andre Drummond does from a rebounding perspective, and there is some level of upside around that shooting. I think we didn't get to see it. I don't think that they wanted to overexpose him in his rookie year. I think that the mid-range game is there. If he can perform at a high level in the pick and rolls, if he can stop with the fouls, right? There's a lot of things he has to work on, but I'll take my chances with him. And then even if it is, because I'm not entirely convinced that Andre Drummond isn't going to get some type of offer from somebody, because he can fit in better on a roster that has the right center ahead of him or the right center in tandem with him. I don't need another non-shooting big on this roster, though. Will LaMarcus Aldridge be back? Will he be retired? Rumors of him going over to Europe maybe to continue his playing career. I like the idea of saying, okay, I have versatile defensive point forward in Ben Simmons. I have versatile defensive big. We're calling him a big in Nicholas Claxton. And then I have the muscle in Day'Ron Sharpe. That's where I start. And then I'll go spend my veteran minimum money. I'll try to get myself a 3-and-D model player. And I'm not talking about the upper echelon. I'm not talking about guys you can't afford because you don't have the money to spend. Veteran minimum players that benefit from being on a roster with other talented superstar quality players. And I think there could be some young names out there on the market that the Nets could target for a very reasonable price, and they will see the benefit of being on the floor with Kyrie Irving, with Kevin Durant, and with Ben Simmons, and with Seth Curry, and with Joe Harris, right? So I think there's some little tweaks here. There's probably a 3 roster spot tweak that can happen here for the Brooklyn Nets that could reshape a little bit how the balance of this roster looks. Because the one thing that I am sick and tired of is seeing players that can't be on the court at both ends. And I understand that Nicholas Claxton isn't necessarily someone that could be on the court on both ends. I get that. But he's 23 years old. And Day'Ron Sharpe is going into his second year. I'm going to keep watching them develop and grow. And Claxton has developed and grown year by year. The injuries are a concern, but when he's on the court, he has shown that he is evolving and developing his game year by year. So I believe in that. I know what Drummond is, even though he's only 28. If the price is right, would I bring him back? Maybe. But I just think having this logjam of players that can't be on the court at all times in any given matchup, it's too much. And you're already going to potentially run into a little bit of concern on the back end of games when it comes to Ben Simmons. The philosophy there has to be, because he is a high basketball IQ guy, we like to think, because he's a great facilitator, we can force issues for you there. And as long as he's capable of knocking down some percentage of his free throws, you'll get across that line when you get there. But guess what? If you had to take him out, you need to know you can bring someone else in. And I'm not talking about bringing in Claxton or bringing in Drummond or bringing in Sharpe. I'm talking about having more players with length and versatility that you can bring in, because otherwise you end up playing small ball with Kevin Durant at the 5. And I just don't think, as we saw, when things get more physical in the playoffs, the Nets are going to be outmatched from a size standpoint, a physicality standpoint, and from a matchup standpoint. So that's the kind of tweaks I'd like to see, to say nothing of Bruce Brown, which we'll get into later in this week here. I want to break that down with Doug. I have an interesting perspective on what I think Bruce Brown would need to be for the Brooklyn Nets going into this upcoming season, as opposed to what he has been up until this point. We'll get into all that good stuff. Like I said, whispers in the wind. We're going to have Barlow on at some point. We're going to talk about non-draft prospects, names to think about the Nets could bring into camp, maybe provide some depth or some long-term prospects to develop in G League. We have a couple of hosts from around the Locked On Nets podcast network that are going to come in. We're going to flesh out some possible trade scenarios for some of the players that we mentioned today. We can take or leave them, but it's interesting to think about. We often develop our own assessment of where a player is and what their value is. Let's get the temperature from other teams in the league, teams that are vying for deep playoff runs, and whether or not the Nets could find a way to improve themselves in the short term while also building a long-term safety net, something that obviously was stripped away when they brought in Kyrie, when they brought in KD, when they traded for James Harden. That'll all be coming up over the course of this and next week. We'll be back in talking about some coaching staff news as well. In the meantime, as Doug Norrie would tell you, head over to YouTube. You subscribe to the channel there. You like it. We're up over 2,400 subscribers over there. Be a part of the journey. Get it on the comments. We really love it. Throw out some names. If you think there's a trade scenario that you like or that you think would be good around, say it around anybody, Kyrie included if you want, but try to keep it realistic. I'll reach out to those hosts and we'll try to get a conversation going around those. We appreciate, as we always say, all the support that we get. Get the podcast feed as well. If you're in the car, you're driving along, throw us in your ears, man. Let the sultry sounds of my voice soothe you all the way into work. No quote without Doug Norrie, as we always say, but we do say, I miss my friend and I can't wait to get him back here soon so we can keep talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.